thou art that. Returning to the consideration of space, we shall avoid introducing unknown quantities. It should be defined only in terms of those two facts that were accepted in the beginning of this commentary, namely the world and consciousness. By the world, we mean the combination of all the causes of our sensations in general. By the material world, we mean the combination of causes of a definite series of sensations, those of sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste, sensations of weight and so on. Space is either a property of the world or a property of our knowledge of the world. Three-dimensional space is therefore either a property of the material world or a property of our receptivity of the material world. Our inquiry is therefore confined to the problem: how to approach the study of space. If we consider the difference between the point and the line, between the line and the surface, surface and solid, i.e. the difference between the laws to which line and plane, plane and surface are subjected, then the difference of phenomena possible in point, in line and in surface, we begin to arrive at some sort of understanding as to how much of the new and inconceivable awaits us in the fourth dimension. As in the point, it is impossible to imagine the line and laws of the line. Thence too, in the line it is impossible to imagine the surface and the laws of the surface. As in the surface it is impossible to imagine a solid and the laws of the solid. Thence too, in our space it is impossible to imagine a body having more than 3 dimensions, and impossible to understand the laws of existence for such a body. However, in studying the mutual relations between the point, the line, the surface and the solid, we begin to understand something about the fourth dimension. Of four-dimensional space, we begin to learn what it can be, when compared with our three-dimensional space, what it cannot be. The latter we learn first of all, which is particularly important because it saves us from inculcated illusions that are detrimental to right knowledge. We learn what cannot be in four-dimensional space, and this permits us to set forth what can be there. In his book, The Fourth Dimension, Hinton proposes a method by which we may approach the problem of higher dimensions. Our space bears within it relations through which we can establish relations to other, higher, spaces. For within space are given the concepts of point and line, line and plane, which really involve the relation of space to a higher space. Let us therefore consider these relations within our space, and see what conclusions can be derived from their investigation. We know that our geometry regards that line as a tracing of the movement of a point, then that surface as a tracing of the movement of a line, and that solid as a tracing of the movement of a surface. Based upon these premises, we can put to ourselves this question: is it not then possible to regard that four-dimensional body as a tracing of the movement of a three-dimensional body? However, what is this movement, and what is its direction? The point moving in space and leaving a trace of its movement, a line, moves in a direction not contained within it. Because in a point there is no direction whatsoever, but line moves in space and leaving a trace of its movement. The surface moves in a direction not contained in it. Because moving in a direction contained within it, a line continues to be a line. That surface, moving in space and leaving a trace of its movement. The solid moves also in a direction not contained within it. If it should move otherwise, then it would remain always the surface. In order to leave a tracing of itself as a solid or three-dimensional figure, it must set off and move in a direction not contained within itself. In analogy with all of this then, that solid, in order to leave as the tracing of its movement, a four-dimensional figure, hypersolid, shall move in a direction not confined within it. Or in other words, it shall come out and set off from itself, moving in a direction that is not presently within. The direction of movement in the fourth dimension lies outside of all those directions that are possible in a three-dimensional figure. Further then, we consider that line as an infinite number of points, the surface as an infinite number of lines, the solid as an infinite number of surfaces. In analogy with all of this, it is possible therefore to consider that it is necessary to regard a four-dimensional body as an infinite number of three-dimensional spaces. Furthermore, we know that the line is limited by points, that the surface is limited by lines, that the solid is limited by surfaces. Is it possible then, that a four-dimensional body is limited by three-dimensional bodies? Or is it possible to say that that line is the distance between 2 points, that surface the distance between 2 lines, and that solid between 2 surfaces? Again, that line separates 2 points or several points from one another. For a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. The surface separates 2 or several lines from each other. That the solid separates several surfaces from one another. As for example, the cube separates 6 flat surfaces, one from another, its faces. The line binds several separate points into a certain whole. A straight, a curved or a broken line. The surface binds several lines into a certain whole. The quadrilateral, the triangle, the solid binds several surfaces into a certain whole. The cube, the pyramid. Is it possible then that 4-dimensional space is the distance between a group of solids? Separating these solids, yet at the same time binding them into some to us inconceivable whole. Even though they appear to be separate from one another. Imagine here, time-lapse photography of an object moving through space, the same object, simply different spaces. Furthermore, we regard that point as a cross-section of a line, that line as a cross-section of a surface, and that surface as a section of a solid. By analogy, it should be possible then to regard the solid, a cube, sphere or pyramid, as a section of a 4-dimensional body. Our entire 3-dimensional space as a section of a 4-dimensional space. If every 3-dimensional body is the section of a 4-dimensional one, then every point of a 3-dimensional body is the section of a 4-dimensional line. Is it not possible thence to regard an atom of some physical body not as something material, but as the intersection of a 4-dimensional line by the plane of our consciousness? The view of a 3-dimensional body as the section of a 4-dimensional body leads to the thought that many, for us, separate bodies may be the sections of parts of one 4-dimensional body. A simple question clarifies this thought. If we imagine a horizontal plane, intersecting the top of a tree and parallel to the surface of the earth, then upon this plane the sections of branches will seem separate and not bound to one another. Yet in our space, from our perspective, these are sections of branches from one tree, comprising together one top, nourished from one root and casting one shadow. Here is another example from Mr. Ledbetter, the theosophical writer, in one of his books. If we touch the polished surface of a table with our fingertips, then upon the surface shall remain just 5 circles, and from this plain presentation it is impossible to construe any idea of the hand or of the man to whom the hand belongs. Upon the surface of the table shall remain 5 separate circles, so how then is it possible to imagine from this a man, with all of the richness of his physical and spiritual life? Our relation to the 4-dimensional world would be analogous to the relation of that consciousness which perceives 5 circles on the table to a man. We simply see fingertips. To us the 4th dimension is inconceivable. We know that it is possible to represent a 3-dimensional body upon a plane, that it is possible to draw a cube, a polyhedron or a sphere. This will not be a real cube or a real sphere though, but merely the projection of a cube or of a sphere upon a plane. We may consider then the 3-dimensional bodies of our space somewhat in the nature of images, of to us incomprehensible 4-dimensional bodies. We have established, by a comparison of the relation of lower dimensional figures to higher dimensional ones, that it is possible to regard a 4-dimensional body as the tracing of the motion of a 3-dimensional body upon the dimension not contained within it. I.e. that the direction of the motion along the 4th dimension lies outside of all the directions that are possible in 3-dimensional space. However, in what direction is it? In order to answer this question it is necessary to discover whether we do not know of some motion not confined in 3-dimensional space. We know that every motion in space is accompanied by that which we call motion in time. Furthermore, we know that everything existing, even if it is not moving in space, moves eternally in time. Then equally in all cases, whether speaking of motion or absence of motion, we have in mind an idea of what was before, what now becomes, and what may follow after. In other words, we have in mind a concept of the linearity of time. The idea of motion of any kind, also the idea of absence of motion, is indissolubly bound up with the idea of time. Any motion or absence of motion proceeds in time, and cannot proceed out of time. Consequently, before speaking of what motion is, we need to answer the question, what then is time? Time is the most formidable and the most complex problem that confronts humanity. Kant regards time as he does space, as a subjective form of our receptivity. I.e., he says that we create time ourselves, as a function of our receptive apparatus. For convenience in perceiving the outside world, reality is continuous and constant, but in order to make possible the perception of it, we must dissect time into separate moments. Imagining it as an infinite series of separate moments, out of which there exists for us only one. In other words, we perceive reality as if through a narrow slit, and what we are seeing through this slit, we call the present. What we saw before, and are now unable to see, we call the past. What we do not quite yet see, but anticipate, we call the future. Regarding each phenomenon as an effect of another, or others. Then this in its turn, as a cause of a third, that is, regarding all phenomena as functionally interdependent upon one another. By this very act, we are contemplating them in time, because we picture to ourselves quite clearly, first, a cause, and then an effect. First an action, and then its function. We cannot contemplate them otherwise. Thus we can say that the idea of time is bound up with the idea of causation, and functional interdependence. Without time, causation cannot exist, just as without time, motion or the absence of motion cannot exist. However, our perception regarding our being in time is entangled and misty, to the point of improbability. First though, let us examine our relation towards the past, present and future. Usually we think that the past already ceases to exist, that it has passed, disappeared, altered and transformed itself into something else. The future for us also does not exist, it does not exist as yet, has not arrived and has not yet formed. By the present, we mean the moment of transition of the future into the past, i.e. the moment of transition of a phenomenon from one non-existence into another non-existence. For that moment only, does a phenomenon exist for us in reality. Before, it existed only in potentiality. Afterward it will exist in remembrance. But this short moment is after all only a fiction, it has no measurement. How long does it last? So we have every right to say that the present does not exist either. We can never catch it, and that which we did catch is always the past. If we are to stop here, then we must admit that the world does not exist, or if it does, then it exists only in some sort of phantasmagoria of illusion. Flashing before our senses for an instant, and then disappearing again. Normally we take no account of this, and do not reflect that our customary view of time leads only to absurdity. Let's imagine a stupid traveler, moving on a journey from one city to another, but presently only halfway between these two cities. The stupid traveler thinks to themselves, that the city from which they departed, just half an hour ago, does not exist now, only the memory of it is left. The walls are ruined, the towers fallen, and the inhabitants have all either died or gone away. Furthermore, that city to which they are destined to arrive in several hours, does not exist now either. But is being hurriedly built for their arrival, and at the very moment of that arrival, all shall magically be ready, populated and set in order. Then on the day of their departure, whenever that might be, all shall be destroyed, just as was the fate of the first city. As absurd as this parody may seem to us, we are thinking of things, in time exactly in the same manner. For everything passes away, and nothing returns. The spring has passed, it does not exist still. The autumn is yet to come, but it does not exist as yet. So then, what does exist? The present, we declare, but the present is not a sizable moment, it is continuously transitioning into the past. So, strictly speaking then, neither the past, nor the present, nor the future exist for us. Nothing exists, yet we are living, feeling, thinking beings, and something surrounds us. Consequently, in our usual attitude toward time, there exists some anomaly. This error is what we shall endeavor to now detect. Nirvana, union with the creative whole, simply expresses the psychological fact of an expansion of consciousness, an expansion when consciousness absorbs all into itself. This absorption of the ocean, by a drop, occurs because consciousness never disappears. I.e., it never vanishes, and never becomes extinguished. When consciousness seems to disappear, in reality it only changes its form, and ceases to be analogous to ours. So we lose the means of ascertaining its existence. We are not speaking of either self-consciousness or cosmic consciousness in the ordinary sense of those words. The first is not that shabby state of automatism at the mercy of external stimuli, which people normally regard as self-consciousness. Neither is the second, some total loss of self into a bigger whole. After meeting Gurdjieff, Ouspensky refined these terms. The first is the third and the second the fourth, objective state of consciousness in the fourth way system. In books on the fourth way, he no longer says much about the possible content of these states, rather offers methods for achieving them. Cosmic consciousness is simply a technical term, which means learning another way of representation in forms, then achieving the required inner change. Cosmic consciousness should enable one to look not from over here, but from over there. In an individual who is self-conscious, and begins to have flashes of cosmic consciousness, there begin independent actions, truly proceeding from oneself, magical and personal immortality. To apprehend that noumenal world, therefore, we must change our form of perception and representation, achieving inner change. How is this then to be done? Ouspensky calls the correct way of approaching the world poetical understanding. Romantic understanding, spoken of previously. Art is the means of perception that we should learn, if we are to enter into communion with the world of causes. Higher art will be the language of the future. Love, as the strongest of emotions, is a force that can disclose these required qualities. From an evolutionary point of view, there is a vast overabundance, beyond what is needed for perpetuating the species, of love. Perhaps the vivid sense of the miraculous, and consciousness of unreality, of bluntly materialistic, subjective life connected with intense experience will bring humanity beyond material facts and help us to see new things. We need also develop our capacity of drawing analogies. As we liberate ourselves from the customary partitions of time and space, we gradually begin to notice analogies between things, where previously, we had seen nothing at all. This should be encouraged, for it broadens and enriches mind, and will eventually make our life something quite different. Opening to us, another plane of being. We need new concepts that go beyond our present logic, that unify vast fields of observation under one common law, that neteru, as if. Every branch of science has created a specialized literature in its own terminology. True synthesis and not just interdisciplinary bridges are therefore needed.